It is good to hack with us for another episode of Unfiltered. You can always catch us a number of ways. Maybe listening right now, Apple, Spotify, everywhere you get your podcast. You also can get me on the artist formerly known as Twitter, X, if you will, at Casey Stern. Jump up into the bio, follow through to the YouTube channel, and you got a number of different ways to get to us and to comment along the way on the show. Now, 286 episodes deep as we welcome in our guest for today, longtime friend, does a terrific job and has for a long time on the Mets and Yankees on SNY, already a very successful author, and now going to be a couple of times over as we talk about his new book upcoming. It is already available for pre-order. It'll be out officially on May 21st, The Yankee Way, The Untold Stories of the Brian Cashman Era. Of course, we'll talk about Andy Martino. Andy, appreciate you, buddy. Thanks for doing this. How are you?
I'm good, Casey. How are you? As you mentioned, a day off from talking about the Mets with me, so nice light emotional lift for you today.
Yeah, it is. It is always a pleasant thing when we get to talk about the past and kind of look back into it. And I wanted to, before I even get into some of the stories that I enjoyed from the book, there are a number of topics you could have covered. You didn't. Your former book, your last book, cheated not in New York. You didn't have to do Mets and Yankees. What made you want to do this book? What drew you to this story?
I appreciate that question, Casey. I would say it's two things: one practical and one a little bit more like ambitious theme wise. That I'll start with the second one. One is if you look at continuity across organizations, the Yankees have that in a way that I couldn't find anywhere else. You can trace Brian Cashman's philosophies and the ideas behind moves that he's still making to player development and coaches and people that were in the organizational infrastructure by the mid to late 70s. And there's a direct line. People talk about Stick Michael, and that was a mentor to him, but there are more unheralded people, like a guy named Bill Livesey, who's well known to people within the game, who developed this so-called Yankee Way, who was hired in 1977. So I thought that the Yankees were a vehicle to tell the story of the evolution of the game itself. And Cashman's personal longevity, even, is a vehicle for that. For example, when he was an intern with the Yankees in 1987, his job was to get the organization the information about what happened in the minor leagues the day before. So he would get to the office at Yankee Stadium. He'd pick up not even a voicemail, an answering machine, and it would be like, "Hi, this is Wally Moon, the manager at Double A Prince William. Andy Stankiewicz went 1 for 3 with a walk. Game time temperature was 72 degrees." And Cashman's writing it all down, and that's how they got that information. This same man is working in an era now where there's advanced uh, biomechanical cameras in these minor league affiliates, so they get real time information on all their players. So I just thought he was a way to tell like how rapidly society's changed. Like in 1987, it was landlines. Now it's iPhones and AI. Same thing with baseball, right? And the Yankees have been continuous through that time. And then secondly, Casey, I just have relationships being in New York, knowing people in that front office, knowing Cashman for a lot of years. And I just had the sense that there were some interesting stories to tell that hadn't been written yet. So it was for those two reasons: the personal sourcing and relationships, and then the broader story think there is to tell.
I want to get into a number of the different stories. As always, we are presented by our good friends at Bet Online, number one source for your sports betting needs, latest odds, lines, and matchup reports. You can get all the fastest and easiest ways for your wagers, casino, and card games. Just get over to the website today. Use your mobile device. Use the code BELIEVE. It's BLEAV. You'll get a 50% bonus on your first deposit. Bet Online, where the game starts. So many stories to get into. I wanted to start here because you mentioned when you talk about Stick Michael, Yankee fans incredibly familiar with him. But I think one of the things that's going to be great about this book for even non-Yankee fans or younger fans who are not really familiar with him to understand is the importance of that man to everything that they know of, especially if you're talking about, for people who are around our age, right? In terms of the Yankees, what did you want most to kind of get across within the stories that you put out there and the background you gave about just the dynamic that was Stick Michael to the Yankee organization?
Yes, almost like the Yankee guiding spirit or something, or their North Star, and still is. I would say, from a baseball standpoint, I wanted to get across how his uh, importance of on base percentage and grinding at bats is still so in that organization's DNA. If you look at the Yankees as we sit here in early April talking about this, and the way Juan Soto and Anthony Volpe and those guys are grinding at bats and getting pitchers out of the game. These are ideas developed by Gene Michael, really starting in the 60s when he was a player. He became a Yankee player in 1968, played with Mickey Mantle, for God's sake. I mean, this guy is so steeped in the organizational, just the time spent there and the things he's been involved in. Played with Mickey Mantle, scouted prospects at the 2017 trade deadline just before his death that they got for Carlos Beltran. I mean, that kind of span is incredible. And also the way he scouted people, and you hear this all the time, Casey, there's that term thrown around like this guy's a super scout or this guy's a great scout. I really wanted to know what that meant. So I talked to people like Billy Epler, who learned scouting from many, but spent a lot of time with Gene Michael and learned a lot from him. And so, what did he see? What actually made him a super scout? So, learning the little nuances of that. This is the stuff that maybe just the baseball nerds like us will nerd out on a little in this story. But you're watching. There's a story where he's watching Andrew McCutchen hit, and he's just like, that guy doesn't quit on the baseball. And Billy Epler's like, well, what does that mean? And excuse me, that he quits on the baseball. I misspoke. He said, what does that mean? And he said, well, his pitch recognition is so good that when the ball is out of the hand, he relaxes his shoulders because he knows he's not going to swing. He knows it's a ball. That's how you find an elite on base percentage guy. He quits on the baseball. And Epler's like, huh, wow, that's so interesting. So then he's building the Mets a couple years ago as a GM. He's finding guys like Mark Canha. Hey, that guy quits on the baseball. So it shows you how embedded all throughout the game Gene Michael's beliefs are, that he taught them, and then people took jobs elsewhere and spread those ideas all around.
Yeah, his personality obviously infectious in a lot of ways to the organization. And I love the stories that are depicted in there. But I want to get into a lot of the different ones relating around Brian and his time as a GM. People forget at the time, I think we're 30, right? Second youngest, I think, in history at the time that he
Yeah.
became general manager of this team. But what was Brian's reaction when because there are a lot of conversations you had with him, obviously, in the making of this book. It's not an autobiography. It's not Brian's book, right? But
Right.
what was his reaction? He's always a very candid guy. I mean, I've
Mm.
found him to be terrific over the years in the way that he handles us in the media, because he's very direct, he's very upfront, very candid, but not one to really want you to peek necessarily the curtain, if you will. What was his reaction when you came to him and said, "Hey, look, this is the book I want to do"?
It was unexpectedly cold. In fact, he and I, as you said, he's an engaging guy, and yes, he's cagey and guarded, and I knew that. But I thought that we had a long and respectful enough relationship, mutually respectful enough relationship. I think he considers my coverage fair, and we talk about the Yankees, what they're doing all the time, because that's my job. So I was like, oh, hey, I'd like to write a book about your time. And I remember calling him, and he's just like, okay. And it was like the flattest okay. It was like, so yes or no. He's like, I don't know, gotta think. It's like, okay. And it was like, I don't want to say it was awkward, but it was like, okay, he just filed me back into like another category of like, all right, I gotta deal with this guy. I don't know. Okay. So like it was some follow-ups. We were at the GM meetings a couple months later. You run into each other at the coffee shop at this resort that everyone's staying at. Hey, you want to talk about the book? Okay. He sits down, he's friendly. I give him my pitch. It's not your book. I just want to interview you. He's kind of looking over my shoulder. He's like, okay. I'm like, do you want to say no and I'll drop it? He's like, no. It's like, okay. So it's like months and months and months and months of that. And I think ultimately he was, I don't want to speak for him, but he definitely didn't want it to be framed as his book, which is a tricky thing when you're still working. Plus, he's not being paid for this, or I mean, if you really the business side, if he wants to write a book, then he gets in advance and writes a book. So he wanted to make sure it wasn't that. So finally, I said, look, here's what I'm doing. I'm going to interview everyone you've ever worked with that I can find. It's going to be my version. You're not going to have any approval over it. And that's what I want to do. But I want to interview you at length. And he said, well, if that's what you're doing, I don't have the right to tell you to not write a book. And that was as close to an endorsement as I got. But then he gave me a lot of time, which I very much appreciated. And that was Brian's little dance around the whole issue.
I love that. And there are a number of great baseball stories within the book, but I have to start with a non-baseball story. How do you want to describe, or how much do you want to share before people read the book about the story with the horse, which to me, of all the stories in the book and all the great baseball knowledge that there is in there, was the thing that probably will stick with me the
That's great.
longest, his description of it. What do you want to tell these soon about Brian Cashman and his relationship with horses?
Well, Casey, given your appreciation of that story, we can break that news on your show here. What happened with the horse? No, it's just, I think that those quotes. Well, let me back up. Uh, John Cashman, Brian Cashman's father, is a Hall of Fame harness racing breeder and executive at Castleton Farm in Kentucky, which is where Brian partly grew up and worked as a young person, which is the equivalent. John Cashman is like the Brian Cashman of harness racing. He's Castleton Farm is an iconic place. He's a Hall of Famer, so it's a very interesting parallel there. And John Cashman started doing that when he was very young, like his son Brian later did with the Yankees. Anyway, Brian learned hard work and work ethic and all that by working on this horse farm as a kid. So he had a couple different jobs. One of them was this horse, and I think this might be the one that stuck with you, Casey, because his job was to hold distract a pregnant mare with a veterinarian, and in the words of Cashman, stuck his arm all the way up that mare's ass. And he had to put and Cashman gets really into it. He's like, that little dog poop. Actually, if you can edit for a second, let me just read the quote. I got the PDF on my phone.
Yeah, of course.
It's funnier than me trying to
Yeah, yeah,
summarize
yeah.
it.
Go ahead. Yeah, I
I
yeah,
agree. I got the biggest
well,
kick
first
out
of
of
all, yeah,
this.
we'll find this. This is one of me, and we're I mean, in this podcast, we have no need for editing. Go find the quote.
Oh, there we go. You don't
I
even
would say
have to
this
edit.
too. It's fun because you see Cashman in his element and for what we're used to with him and how we know him.
Mhm. Yes, exactly. And I'm almost
Yeah, it
there.
was
Um,
it is yeah, that's all right. It's all right. Go, I will tell people while we're doing this. You can get to us a number of ways. Apple, Spotify, everywhere you're getting your podcast, where most of you are listening. But also, we are new, and I've been joking that it's like on MySpace when Tom was your only friend. We're new on Instagram, but you can get over there at Unfiltered with Casey Stern and give us a follow. And of course, follow along and watch any of our videos and any of our episodes. Now 285, 286 episodes deep. You can get us over on our YouTube channel, Unfiltered with Casey Stern, as well, all part of the Believe Network, and of course, presented by our good friends online at Bet Online, as we are chatting with Andy Martino, SNY, Mets and Yankees. They were talking Yankees, though, and his new book, Yankee Way, which will debut officially, get out there for all of you in the public on May 20th. You can pre-order now and get great stories like the baseball ones we've been discussing and the non-baseball ones, including the horse. Do you want to further depict the story now, Andy, of what happened here with Brian Cashman and the horse?
you've got a pregnant mare, Cashman recalls, and you've got a vet with a glove that's on that stretches like, you ever pick up dog poop with a little dog poop bag? Well, it's kind of like that material, see through so you can see your hand. It's a glove that goes from your hand all the way up to your shoulder. While the veterinarian donned that glove, Cashman's job was to pull a device called a twitch. This was a round piece of rope attached to a stick. By the way, this is one of the great things about reporting. You get to Google, like, what's a twitch, and you learn something very random. Through the mare's top lip, and then he twists the lip. So here's Cashman. So the mare is focusing on, what the fuck are they doing to my lip? They've got my lip caught, Cashman says. Well, someone else is holding the tail of the mare up so the vet can check on the pregnancy by sticking his hand through that nasty glove that goes all the way up. So his hand will go all the way deep into the mare's ass. Obviously, he has to make a pathway to pull the shit out and dump it on some poor bastard, typically myself, holding the tail up. It was fucking gross, bro. Those are good quotes. What can I say? And
It's
later
fantastic. I
on,
mean, the fact that it's Brian Cashman is fantastic.
yeah, exactly. And I think his personality comes out there. It's a funny story. And later he does tell something he was very proud of, which is his dad had him break a horse and the process that goes into that, which I learned, and the time that goes into breaking a horse. And I guess if there's a point, if there's an insight to be gleaned from this about Cashman as he moves forward in life, is that this guy is all work. I mean, not uncommon among baseball executives, but his dad was so focused on the horse farm. He worked Brian to the bone when violating child labor laws, as Brian now jokes, and all of his siblings. And Brian jumped right into that Yankee job right out for these summers, working with these horses, and dove into that job 24/7. And now he's, I think, 56 years old and is still at it without coming up for air once. And that's sort of where he learned his work ethic, is with those horses.
I love that. And, we mentioned, obviously everybody knows about Brian's run, but when he started and went, and made that travel and that path, which you so well describe here in the book, from the intern going to being the second youngest GM of all time, it was at a time in 98 where we're embarking on the best team I've ever seen in my time watching Major League Baseball or covering it, which is the 98 Yankees. And one of the crazier parts of the book, but I think it was important that you put in there because I always think about the pressure that you must have and how different it is being a Yankee captain, sure, being a Yankee shortstop, okay, Yankee catcher, a Yankee manager. How about being the GM during the Steinbrenner era? And I don't mean Hal and Hank, I'm talking about George. And it's depicted in the book 4 games into the 98 season. And I wrote this quote down where the book that George tells Stick Michaels, Stick, you're going to have to, quote, go back in there and take over. I don't know if Brian can do this. That's after four
Yeah, how about that?
games in 1998.
Yeah,
That is hard to believe.
right. So if I believe they were 1-3 at that time, I'm not looking at it right now, but they got off to a slow
Yeah, that's what
start
it says.
and then
Yeah.
they started winning. Right. So if they had lost another 4 in a row, which happens randomly to any team at any time, right? It's definitely possible that the Cashman era
Hmm.
is 2 weeks and not 2+ decades. And that, you're right. And the fact that the guy is held on to the job as long as he has. I mean, obviously George hasn't been around since 2010 and was in decline for a few years before that. Hal's a different vibe, but still, all the pressures in that market and being able to hang in there speaks to his toughness, speaks to the respect that they have for him on the inside of that organization. So yeah, the fact that you could get fired, almost fired 4 games in, and then hold on to the thing for a half a century, quarter century, excuse me.
There's a lot of conversation in the book about the relationship with Derek Jeter and specifically the attempt to bring A-Rod in and how it was brought up to Jeter and that phone call. There's a lot that's played out in the media and publicly about that relationship, not only with Alex, obviously, and with Derek, but with Brian and with Derek as well. What did you learn, if anything, when you put together this book, Andy, about the relationship between Brian Cashman and Derek Jeter that maybe you didn't know even while covering it?
Good question. Two things, probably, that it was more broken than I even realized during the worst of it, because didn't they really had a, I guess, what you consider a break over Jeter's refusal to publicly back A-Rod during all the booing and the tough time A-Rod had with the Yankee fans for so many years, and some other smaller issues. So, and by the time they were negotiating Jeter's final free agent contract, it was really ugly in public, and it was messier than even I knew. And I also didn't know that they had made peace, which is a scene I opened the book with, in Cooperstown at the beautiful Lotus Saga Hotel where the Hall of Famers stay. I'm sure you know it, Casey. And they
Yep.
they Jeter in 2021, and Jeter's right before his ceremony, he pulls Cashman aside. He's an executive now with the Marlins. He goes, "I get it now. I want to make peace," and they have a nice conversation. So I didn't realize how bad it got, and I didn't realize it had come back around to some extent to get to a better place.
Yeah, you think about the relationship between obviously Alex and Derek. That was something that was played out publicly. There wasn't as much talk about Derek Jeter's situation outside of what happened at the contract at the end of his career. So it really is interesting just to see how broken it was. In general, what was the sense that you got from players that you talked to and people around their organization? that didn't work with Brian or for him in the front office, but were down on the field about the relationship that he had during his tenure with those players overall?
Gene Afterman, who's the assistant GM, who's been one of Cashman's most trusted confidants for more than 20 years, says Brian doesn't have a great bedside manner, but he is very direct. So um, players are going to not always or even often appreciate what Cashman has to say or how he says it, but I'm sure there is some appreciation of uh, he's honest. Like he'll say things to players like, "Hey, we're trying to trade you. You're not any good here." That kind of thing. It's just so direct. People are like, "Wow." So I wouldn't say that it's a warm and fuzzy relationship between him and the players, but that's not anything about his personal characteristics. It's really more that he has a clear idea of what he thinks his job is. And his job is not to be friends with the players. I mean, there was a thing with Aaron Judge uh, having his contract extension offer announced and not being happy with that. So Cashman is still not afraid to get on the wrong side of star players because he just sees what's best for the Yankees. I work for the Steinbrenner family. I work for the New York Yankees. I'm the steward of this franchise. Whatever he thinks is best for the organization, whether it's trying to get Jeter to move off a shortstop to center and being annoyed when he wouldn't, it's whether he wants to get Jeter to support A Rod. That's not because Cashman and A Rod were best friends. That's because Alex Rodriguez is the best player in baseball at the time. We need him to feel comfortable. The Yankees need him to feel comfortable. So Cashman views it as his job to do what's best for the Yankees. And that means that he's probably not exchanging Christmas cards with a ton of ex players because he's the boss in that environment. And it's not necessarily one that's fostering a lot of friendships, but he's okay with that. He's got his friendships elsewhere in life.
There have been a lot of conversations that, certainly Twitter's its own animal, but with the kind of this portion, I guess, this latest chapter or two of the tenure with Brian Cashman, is he stale? Some of the specific moves, obviously Donaldson, you could pick out a couple of others in terms of recent time,
Mhm.
but in general, Yankee fans haven't been overly pleased. Do you think that because of the latest few years and where we sit here, that Yankee fans and maybe New York as a whole will always underrate the impact of Brian Cashman?
Certainly in real time, and I think that's a natural thing for sports fans, and it's okay mostly, unless it gets too toxic. Your current manager and your GM, and even star players, sometimes you dislike because things aren't perfect or exactly as you imagine them as a fan. And then oftentimes, in retrospect, uh, there's an appreciation. I think a great example of this on the Mets side, Casey's Terry Collins, right? It's like Met fans going crazy over his moves,
Mhm.
like they do with every manager. Then he retires. That video comes out of him arguing with Tom Hallion, the umpire, and people go, "Oh, this guy really cared. He had a lot of fire in his belly, and now he's beloved." Uh, so it's always I think Cashman will be appreciated in retrospect. He will be inducted into Cooperstown, one of the few executives to ever enjoy that, and it'll be difficult for Yankee fans to not see at that point. I think everything that his tenure brought them, all the joy, and even in the years since 2009, the perennial contention. It's not good enough for what the Yankees set up for themselves, but uh, it would be worse to root for a team that is intermittently competitive. And I think that that could happen to the Yankees at some point under a different regime, and then fans would look back on the Cashman era as, "Wow, we were in the race every year." So yeah, probably only afterward will he be uh, regarded that way because that is it with everybody, right? I mean, fans were all over Joe Girardi, and now Boone hasn't won, so now they love Girardi. I mean, that's just like a normal thing with sports fans psychology, I guess.
Yeah, and Met fans obviously already wanting Buck Showalter, some of them back, who, by the way, is,
Right.
is prominently displayed. Didn't talk about that, but I love the stuff about Buck in the book and really kind of a look at that clubhouse, which I think apathy was one of the words that was described before kind of Buck got in there. So a lot in the
Mhm.
book to get to way pre Brian Cashman into the Brian Cashman era. If you're a Yankee fan, it is a can't miss. May 21st, it is out. You can already pre order it now. It is called The Yankee Way, The Untold Stories of the Brian Cashman Era. Andy, appreciate this, man. Thank you so much for doing it and all the best and congrats on yet another book, sir.
Appreciate you having me, Casey. Thank you.
Anytime. You can get us on Unfiltered anytime. Apple, Spotify, everywhere you get your podcasts. Plenty of ways across the board. Of course, YouTube channel, which you can get in our bio on Twitter or X, if you will, at Casey Stern. As always, we at Unfiltered are presented by our good friends at Bet Online.